So good evening. It is a real pleasure to introduce Yuk Hui, one of the most interesting contemporary thinkers of technology, or more precisely, of what he defines himself as techno-diversity. Yuk studied computer engineering at the University of Hong Kong. He wrote his PhD dissertation under Bernard Stiegler at Goldsmiths University, London, and obtained his habilitation in philosophy of technology from Louis Fana University in Germany, and he's currently an associate professor at the City University of Hong Kong. Over the past 5 years, he has published 4 monographs: The Mode of Existence of Digital Objects, The Question Concerning Technology in China, Recursivity and Contingency, and quite recently, Art and Cosmotechnics. Recursivity and Contingency is his first book, translated into Polish and published by the University of Silesia Press. And the book is going to be available just in 2 weeks or so. Here's the advanced copy. Natalia Juchniewicz, who wrote an editorial review of the book, pointed out, I quote, on the Polish editorial market, the book can serve as an excellent introduction to contemporary philosophy of technology, free from naivete and simplifications, end quote. A distinctive feature of all Yuk Hui's works is that they show that our digital future doesn't really have to be either fully automated or transhumanist. They also offer an alternative scenario of this technological future, and more importantly, provide us with solid conceptual tools for debating about technology beyond the bars around artificial intelligence, which seems to penetrate all spheres of human activity. The title of Yuk Hui's lecture today is War and Machine. Yuk, the floor is yours.
Okay, right, so I say again, thank you very much for coming, and I want to thank the Biennale for the invitation, and also Michał for the introduction, and to present this book, Recursivity and Contingency, in Polish, and I feel really honored to be here to speak about this today, and I want to explain a little bit why I have chosen this subject to speak, because of in January, when we had a meeting with Michał and also with Pavel from and others from the Biennale, everyone was shocked by the fact that the war started in Ukraine, and so many refugees came to Poland, and what would be the future of Europe, but also the future of the world. So then I proposed that maybe we can reflect on the question of the war in related to the question that is Biennale wanted to upstairs want to address concerning the question of technology, with explicit reference to the work of Peter Thiel, where we can also say he's a thinker of geopolitics and technology. So today I'm going to give a talk titled War and Machine, but please don't expect that I'm going to talk about which model of weapons that Russia is using against Ukraine. I'm going to approach it from a rather conceptual perspective, and I'm going to start with an essay that is already forgotten by most of the people, an essay written by the French philosopher Henri Bergson in 1914, on the eve of when the First World War started. So I will start my presentation. Well, you know, when I say the war related to technology, and I think this quote from Putin is probably the most representative of what the relation between war and technology, but also the future of war. So in this talk will be divided into 4 chapters. The first chapter will be titled War, Hubris, and the Disproportion of Organs. So I will start. In 1821, Hegel published his most important political philosophy, Elements of the Philosophy of Right, in which Hegel claims that freedom is only possible in the modern political state. So only the modern political state can realize freedom. Hegel distinguishes freedom from the arbitrary, the willkürlich. Rights, as indicated in laws, are only abstract and arbitrary. Therefore, the right indicated in laws is not yet freedom. Freedom, to the contrary, is something concrete in the sense that it is abstract right sublated, namely reflected and negated. Freedom does not mean contingency as that which resists against the necessity of laws. In the contrary, freedom is necessary, is necessity. It is the other side of the contingent of the zufällig. The modern political state is able to realize freedom because of its organic structure, made possible by the sublation of family and the civil society, as well as its division of powers. The Prussian state was the realization of an organic totality, according to Hegel, and I want to emphasize here the term organic totality, because I also want to refer to this book where I make the distinction. I try to reread the history of modern European philosophy through the dichotomy of organism and mechanism. So Hegel claims that modern political states is able to realize freedom insofar it is an organic totality. In 1914, when Henri Bergson gave his inaugural speech as the newly elected president of the Académie des Sciences Morales et Politiques, he addressed the outbreak of the First World War by accusing Germany of representing machinism and mechanism. He said, after the great achievement, in poetry, art and metaphysics, Germany turned itself into a mechanical machine in the domain of industry, administration, and the military, so on and so forth. Bergson saw a mechanism fundamental to the mentality of Germany, which was not only metaphorical, but also reflected in the machines produced in Germany. I quote, a diabolical artifice. He called it a diabolical artifice, which instead of producing a spiritualization of matter, ended in a mechanization of the spirit. So instead of a spiritualization of matter, it produced its opposite, the mechanization of the spirit. Terms such as mechanism, mechanic, mechanization appeared 19 times in his short speech, shorter than what I'm going to speak about today. The opposition between organism and mechanism stands as the foundation of modern European philosophy, as what I try to show in this book translated into Polish. Hegel's praise of the Prussian state and Bergson's critique form a sharp contrast. One could, of course, associate Bergson's accusation with his infamous critique against mechanism and his own vitalist position. Bergson is known also as, mostly as a vitalist philosopher. Almost a century after Hegel's justification of the organic nature of the Prussian state in his philosophy of right, Bergson, in his speech, claimed the opposite, that Prussia had turned Germany into a scientific barbarity or a systematic barbarity. In Bergson's address, we can identify two critiques, and I wanted to emphasize on the difference and importance of the difference of these two critiques. One is a vitalist critique against mechanism, which is consistent with Bergson's own writing. That is to say, mechanism, the way we understand human or living being as a mechanism, failed to explain life because mechanism wants to explain life without life. So it needs a vital force in the living being. So that is the vitalist critique of Bergson. The other critique I want to emphasize is an organological critique. An organological critique. That is to say that machines are considered here precisely as artificial organs, and that wars originate from the incompatibility or malaise produced by these organs, the technical organs. Bergson considered the war of 1914 resulted from the development of mechanical science, as he writes that the 19th century has given, I quote, a wholly unforeseen extension to the mechanical arts and had equipped man in less than 50 years with more tools than he had made during the past 1,000 of years he had lived on the earth. So 19th century produced huge amounts of artificial organs, more than any epoch in the human history. This rapid technological development for Bergson is the source of war. Although already in his 1907 creative evolution, Bergson endured tools and machines with the status of artificial organs. So in his 1907 book, Creative Evolution, he already considered machines and tools as artificial organs. And the human being is, first of all, Homo faber, before Homo sapien. And for this reason, the epistemologist Georges Canguilhem considered Bergson as the first thinker of a general organology. The mechanization in the 19th century has caused an unexpected effect, according to Bergson. I quote, his body became suddenly and prodigiously increased in size, without his soul being able at the same time to dilate to the dimensions of his new body. The body expands, but the soul is too small. In his two sources of morality and religion, published in 1932, Bergson repeated his analysis. That's to say, between 1914 to 1932. I quote, now in this body, distended out of all proportion, the soul remains what it was, too small to feel it, too weak to guide it. Hence the gap between the two. Hence the tremendous social, political, and international problems. And it's very interesting, international problems, which are thus so many definitions of this gap, and which invoke so many chaotic and ineffectual efforts to fill it. What we need are new reserves of potential energy, moral energy this time, end of quote. Bergson understands, as said before, tools and instruments as artificial organs. In the 19th century, the mechanical artifacts have evolved in the speed that created a disturbance between the inorganic organs, machines, tools, and the organic organs that the human body is. Human society is always haunted by a negative organology, namely that these artificial organs produce a hubris which expresses itself as moral, social, international problems. This hubris, what the Greek called hubris, is a form of excess, which is considered the origin of war in Bergson's analysis, must be taken care of before this self-destruction takes place. So how can we take care of this hubris? that is the source of war. However, a moral energy was lacking at the time to pacify the conflict between the organs, which produced violence and led to destruction. And while all the world was trying to spiritualize machine, Bergson claims that an inferior force, that means mechanization, machine thinking, was taking it in an opposite direction. The inferior force of mechanism, as we have mentioned earlier, fails to explain life. And therefore, when it dominates the tendency of the society, it reverses the relation between life and technology. Means technology is no longer in service of life, like what we have seen in the symposium, but rather it becomes largely entropic, like what we have already heard in the previous panel. Bergson expressed his anger in a series of questions in the 1914 speech. It's a very long quote, but I think it would be really interesting to read together because I think these questions resonate with ours. What kind of a world would it be if this mechanism should seize the human race entire, and if the peoples, instead of raising themselves to a richer and more harmonious diversity, as persons may do, but to fall into the uniformity of things? What kind of society would that be which should mechanically obey a word of command mechanically transmitted, which should rule its signs and its conscience in accordance therewith, and which should rule among with the sense of justice, the power to discern between truth and falsehood? What would mankind be when brute force should hold the place of moral forces? What new barbarism, this time final, would arise from these conditions to stifle feeling, ideas, and the whole civilization of which the old barbarism contained the germ? What will happen, in short, if the moral effort of humanity should turn it in its check at the moment of attaining its goal, and if some diabolical contrivance should cause it to produce the mechanization of spirit instead of the spiritualization of matter? So these are the questions he asked with anger, with extreme anger. We may say that wars in general, in the analysis of Bergson, is an organological problem. When the spirit fails to integrate the artificial organs in a compatible way, it could be applied to Germany of the First World War, but of course also the Second World War, Japan of the Second World War, and more recently, Russia of the war in Ukraine. For the thinkers of the Kyoto School in Japan, modern science and technology are symbols of the decadence of the West, which the East was forced to adopt. And for the Russian right-wing thinkers, such as, I quote here, Maxim Kalashnikov and Alexander Dugin, Western technology is the synonym of the Antichrist, of which the Silicon Valley is the temple. So there is this very interesting book published in 2016 by a right-wing thinker called Robot and the Cross. The techno meaning of the Russian idea basically is an accusation of, by saying that the technology developed that Russian is now using or developed in the past century is nothing Russian. And this is something resonated with Dugin as well. And so, and in a dialogue, where in a debate with Dugin that I had 2 years ago, he claims that Western technology is a synonym of the Antichrist, and the Silicon Valley is its temple. So Western science and technology represses Russian truth. So this is also the quest of Putin, the quest of Dugin, and right wings. Now I move to the second part, because I think the analysis, if in the first part we have seen Bergson's critique that mechanism was the source of war. Now in the second movement or the second chapter, I'm going to problematize the Bergson's critique. I want to problematize his critique. One might want to context against Bergson's analysis of mechanization and war. Because the mechanization that Bergson described belongs, first of all, to the early modern time. Mechanization was the continuation of a mechanist philosophy that already culminated since the 17th century during the time of René Descartes. Is modern technology still such a form of mechanization? If we look at the Second World War and One World, what we witness are new types of machines. In Reconsider and Contingency in this book, I have attempted to show that cybernetics present itself as a rupture with 17th century mechanism. And in the words of its founder, Norbert Wiener, who appear in these slides, that in cybernetics one finds the reconciliation of Bergson's vitalism and Newton's classical mechanics. The first chapter of Wiener's book, Cybernetics or Control and Communication in the Animal and Machine, and I think most of the readers forgot about this, the title of the first chapter, Newtonian and Bergsonian Time. So Wiener basically launched a critique against Bergson. Because if the Newtonian time or the Newtonian motion, time is mechanist and time symmetric, hence reversible, and the Bergsonian time is biological, creative, and irreversible. So the opposition, but Newtonian time, mechanical, repetitive, and reversible. Bergsonian time, biological, creative, and irreversible. This difference between Newtonian time and Bergsonian time defines the boundary between physics and biology, machine and organism. The task of cybernetics was to show that with the advancement in physics, especially statistical mechanics and quantum mechanics, it is possible to employ notions of feedback and information to construct a cybernetic machine that breaks the boundary between machine and organism. Therefore, towards the end of the chapter, we read from Wiener, the modern automation, cybernetic machines, exist in the same sort of Bergsonian time as the living organism, and hence there is no reason in Bergson's considerations why the essential mode of functioning of the living organism should not be the same as that of the automation of this type. In fact, the whole mechanist vitalist controversy has been relegated to the limbo of badly posed questions. So if Bergson was able to claim that mechanism was the cause of war, Wiener basically responds that the machines that we develop today already overcome the boundary, the opposition between machine and organism. Wiener's argument is even more self-evident today. When we consider recent development in artificial intelligence, machine learning, biotechnologies, but also system theories and complex theory of complexity and so on and so forth, then the question is, shall we say after cybernetics, Bergson's critique of machines is no longer valid because cybernetics has claimed, and we should also act as witness today, that the mechanism and vitalism opposition is no longer valid. More than 70 years after Wiener's cybernetics, the machine dream continues and goes further. In a 1963 article by Norbert Wiener titled Some Moral and Technical Consequences of Automation, Wiener rejected the stereotype that machines cannot have any originality. Instead, he sees, and we can confirm him, 60 years after his observation, that machines are more than ever able to assimilate the behavior of a living being. Nonetheless, Wiener expresses his worries. Oh, it's not here. He says, I quote, "One of the chief causes of the danger of disastrous consequences in the use of learning machine is that man and machine operates on two distinct time scales. So the machine is much faster than man, and the two do not gear together without serious difficulties." So basically, the development of machine is so fast in terms of its size, of its capacity. And human beings, in order to deal with machine, you have to project 50 years further. So you have the future vision for 50 years. But however, you can never anticipate. So therefore, the time gap becomes larger and larger. That this organological rupture will only become larger in the future. We could say that Wiener's warming is twofold. One is that the artificial organs override the organic organs, and the latter is rendered obsolete and helpless. Secondly, scientists must think ahead of themselves in a much longer time scale, for example, at least 50 years ahead, to anticipate the worst scenario which might arise due to the speed of automation. But of course, we know that we couldn't in view of the pandemic and so on. In this large scale, the human beings have to live in uncertainty and insecurity. Today, maybe we can say that the vitalist critique of Bergson is losing its ground, while his organological critique is more significant than ever. So at the very beginning, I made this distinction between a vitalist critique and an organological critique. The latter increasingly resonates, the organological critique resonates with Wiener's last warming. So this book on the right is God and Golem, INC, is the last book of Norbert Wiener, the founder of Cybernetics, published the same year of his death. I quote, "What we now need is an independent study of systems involving both human and mechanical elements. This system should not be prejudiced either by a mechanical or anti-mechanical bias. I think that such a study is already underway and that it will promise a much better comprehension of automatization. Today we are witnessing more disproportions between artificial organs and the soul for two major reasons after Wiener's warming. First of all, the transhumanist ideology has been promoting human enhancement as a future, namely one can directly modify organs via either DNA technologies or nanotechnologies in order to augment our senses and the function of our bodies. Senses and the body are more and more exhausted by consumerism. When human enhancement will be legalized, where we can also anticipate this day, because so many huge IT companies like Google have been invested so much on biotechnology companies, then we enter a process of artificial selection, subsumed to consumerism and no longer natural selection in the sense of Darwin or cultural selection in the sense of racial politics. Secondly, technologies are able to produce organs that are far more gigantic than human organs, where this is already self-evident. They constitute gigantic platforms and systems, such as Google or Facebook, in which human beings are subordinated to the system as a mere data, and as it is called, new extractionism in this biennale. These gigantic artificial organs penetrate everywhere and become preemptive, totalizing systems, because it is able to anticipate and to preempt what you are going to do. On the individual level, as we are told, and I quote here, a statement from this biennale, algorithms know more about us than we do ourselves. You probably get a sticker from the biennale. It constitutes a new mechanism of marketing and consumerism on the level of the state. They imply preemptive wars, and this is particularly true after 9/11. All wars become more or less preemptive. The anti-terrorist wars the anti-potential threat like the one in Iraq in 2003 and now in Ukraine. Now I move to the third part, tendencies, conflict, and mysticism. So the question that I want to raise is how to overcome this negative organology, namely how to take care of the hubris produced by machines. Towards the end of The Two Sources of Morality and Religion, a book published by Bergson in 1932, in a session titled The True Vocation of Machines, Bergson provided some thought how to put machines at proper places. How can we find a good use of machines? If it is called the true vocation, it is because machines have been used in the wrong way, which produces a mechanization of spirit instead of a spiritualization of matter. And I think we discussed about this already in the past few days. For Bergson, the mechanization of spirit does not mean turning the human beings into a mechanized being, but rather it promoted a life based on material comfort, amenities, and luxuries, purely consumerism. Industrialization since the late 18th century has been largely about mobilization of machines in the production and distribution process. Industrialization depends on a generalized process of mechanization which enable mass production. And mass production in turn leads to overproduction. Overproduction then necessarily demands consumption. And then consumerism. Bergson didn't have the word consumerism in his time, because we know this is a later development, so he often uses words such as taste for luxuries and the mere comfort. The mechanization of the spirit leads to an end involving an exaggerated comfort and luxury for the few, rather than liberation for all. And this is even, self-evident today. Today, consumerism becomes the most important component of our economy, and addition to consumption, including shopping, video games, and so on and so forth, constitutes the most perverted form of alienation. For Bergson to resolve the problem of mechanization is not to abandon machines and go back to simple tools. Instead, he understands mechanization as a natural gift that the human beings possesses. Mechanization is a tendency being opposed to another tendency, such as static religion to dynamic religion, intelligence to instinct. So here I want to emphasize that the concept of tendency is fundamental to Bergson's analysis of the evolution of the humankind and society. Tendency, very important word. Now we may say that there is a fundamental tendency, which is the impetus of life, what he called élan vital. This original tendency bifurcates into two opposed tendencies or frenzies. And these two tendencies compete with each other to become dominant. Bergson rejected the teleology of history, and indeed for him, finality is external or it is nothing at all. And there is no predefined plot of evolution and history. History is a recursive process moving from one tendency to its opposite side and then keep moving on to another opposed tendency. So we move from one tendency to the opposite one and then back and so on. If we can say that mechanization is one of these two tendencies coming out of the impetus of life, then spiritualization is another tendency that has been waiting for its own time to come and take over as the dominating tendency. So against mechanization is spiritualization. However, what is particular in this struggle is not one cancelling the other, but rather one takes the lead by integrating the other. These two competing tendencies have to be materialized. In other words, even the tendency of spiritualization is not simply anything happening in the mind alone, it has to present itself in material forms. Now, what consists in this process of spiritualization or kind of mysticism of Bergson? So what really is this spiritualization or this mysticism that he was talking about? What Bergson means by mysticism is not the conventional understanding of being in contact with a spiritual power from another world or universe. Instead, being mystic means, first of all, the capacity to see the limit of the civilization. To see the limit of the civilization dominated by one tendency, and then to use intuition to envelop it or to resituate in a larger reality, the impetus of life. So mysticism here means to see the limit of the civilization and then try to find a new reality that we can resituate this limit, such a limit. A closed society, when it comes to its end, has exhausted impetus which motivated the dominant tendency of that society, for example, mechanization. So in view of this simple impulse, the impetus will have to be directed towards another tendency, here quote. If the individual is fully conscious of this, if the fringe of intuition surrounding his intelligence is capable of expanding sufficiently to envelop its object, then it is the mystic life. So it's nothing about, in touch with God or so on, but seeing the limit of the civilization. It is already the beginning of a mystic life. The mystic life is a counter tendency, the capacity of seeing the limit of the current dominating tendency, mechanism, development of technology, and so on. Being aware of the limit and through intuition, the tendency is countered by another tendency in order to return to the impetus of life. It is in this occasion that Bergson proposed. And this is a very important and really significant passage in the whole book. So let us not merely say, as we did above, that the mystical summons up the mechanical. La mystique appelle la mécanique. We must add that the body, now larger, calls for a bigger soul, and that mechanism should mean mysticism. The origins of the process of mechanization, body proportion, are indeed more mystical than we might imagine. Machinery will find its true vocation again. It will render service in proportion to its power only if mankind, which it has both still lower to the earth, can succeed through it, through technology, through mechanism, in standing erect and looking heavenwards. The fundamental question is, how could we spiritualize through these technologies, through mechanism, in his time? So, it is not to say that mechanism is something mystical, but rather mechanism, first of all, is the materialization of one of the tendencies of the elan vital. That is to say, mechanism does not come out of any abstract thinking, but it has its origin in the impetus of life. Secondly, mechanization, insofar it is a natural gift to the human being, which generates irrefutable organs, then we have to allocate it with a right vocation so that it can be in service of humanity instead of ceaselessly producing hubris. How could we understand this in our context today, almost 100 years after Bergson's organological critique of wars? How should we understand, what would be the meaning of this, what he said to us today? And that is how we read philosophy. What is the relevance of someone said 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago to us today? In this final chapter, titled Locality, Incompatibility, and Technodiversity, I'm going to address this question. But very briefly, because of the lack of time, but I hope that we can discuss later. Today, our civilization is dominated by economic competition and military expansion between the sovereign state. And more than ever, technology defines the sovereign power. As like what Putin said in September 1st, 2017. To the Russian children, I quote, "Whoever leads in AI will dominate the world." And very interesting, he said this, a month after China announced that by 2030, China will be the leading country in AI. Is the technological acceleration a way out of the impulse of modernity? So, all these competitions that we are seeing, military expansion, economic competition based on technology, moving towards singularity, technological singularity, basically it has a theological meaning, or theological significance. That means we are all moving towards a kind of apocalypse in one way or another. We have already heard from Stephen Hawking, who died a few years ago, I quote, "The development of full artificial intelligence could spell the end of the human race. It could take off on its own and redesign itself at an ever-increasing rate. Humans who are limited by slow biological evolution could then compete and would be superseded." Now, as well as, though really ironically, from the libertarian and entrepreneur Elon Musk, who calls for an AI slowdown. I try to convince people to slow down AI. Very ironic. It is not that AI is going to rebel against humans, such as what we see in popular science fiction movies, but rather, as we have been trying to show, how a negative organology is produced due to the failure to put these inorganic organs in proper place. And as a consequence, this incompatibility is expressed as hubris, as a necessity to develop into an immunological defense, a reactionary movement or fascist movement. Now, I want to ask, is mysticism a response to this danger of wars? And we are only at the very beginning. There are more to come, and probably bigger ones. Is mysticism of Bergson a response to the danger of wars? Or maybe we have to reinterpret the question of mysticism radically. When Bergson says that, I quote, "Mechanism should mean mysticism," he didn't oppose mechanism and mysticism anymore. Instead, he sees mechanism and mysticism as two tendencies coming out of the same élan vital. And that mysticism has to make mechanism its own possibility. As we have seen earlier, that a mystic life does not mean a religious life. A mystic life starts when one sees the limit of the dominating tendency, like Bergson saw the limit of the constant materialization of spirit before the First World War, when he says, "Which instead of reinforce, I quote, a richer and more harmonious diversity, it imposed the uniformity of things." And we have to pay extra attention to the contrast between diversity and uniformity. And if I will have time, I also want to respond to the previous question about is diversity a way out of the technological impasse, and how to think about this. We have to pay extra attention to the contrast between diversity and uniformity in this quote. The universality and homogeneity of mechanism in Bergson's writing was countered by the mystic life, which spiritualizes machine and rejects consumerism. The mystic life diversifies since there is no single mystic life, because seeing the limit is one thing and the response to the limit is another thing. Now, I have suggested elsewhere to interpret the meaning of diversity and locality to counter the universal conceptualization of technology which dominates since the European modernity. So this is a work that I start publishing in 2016 in a book titled The Question Concerning Technology in China, an essay in cosmotechnics, where I try to ask what does it mean by technology in China, or in Chinese, and in ancient Chinese culture, and by in contemporary China. What is the meaning of technology? And later also develop in recursivity and contingency. Here I wanted to say, I do want to explain the meaning about locality, even though we discussed a lot already today. And locality means two things. First of all, it means to give technology a place, because technology recognizes space and not place. Technology, we have a logic of space in technology, but we don't have a logic of place in technology, not yet. To give technology a place means to resituate it in a broader reality, which we can also call it mystic with Bergson. But of course, it could be a larger cosmological framework and so on. Secondly, it means the capacity, and I want to emphasize capacity. So locality for me is also capacity to rediscover and reinvent a techno-diversity which has been undermined in the process of modernization. So I want to refer here to the paleontologist Henri Bergson, and Dan also mentioned during his response to one of the questions. Henri Bergson took up Bergson's concept of tendency and formulates what he calls a technological tendency. So Henri Bergson, and I think this is a very under-researched subject, because Henri Bergson was first of all a really attentive reader of Bergson. He took up the concept of tendency from Bergson's two sources of morality and religion, and he developed into two other concepts. One is technical tendency. It means that a tendency that will be accepted in all environments, especially a tendency which is based on laws of nature. Now, for example, we have never seen a squared or triangular wheel in any civilization. When you push on a wagon, you never see a squared wheel. It's always round. All we have seen are round wheels. Bergson developed a different tendency, which he calls technical fact, meaning contingently produced during the encounter between the technical tendency and a particular environment. For example, we found in almost every civilization the use of spoons. However, these spoons have different shapes, lengths and handles, as is shown here in this book, Milieu et Technique. The technical tendency and technical facts are in fact two different tendencies. And this is a play of words. He called one technical tendency, the other technical fact, as if technical fact is not tendency. But actually these two are actually two tendencies. One universalizes, the other diversifies. Now, we cannot go into the profound thinking of Bergson beyond this simple example of weapon of spoons here. He has a very complex theory of human evolution and the communication of different cultures through technology. Because diversification is not only about functional aesthetics. So, for example, here you see the spoons, and the handles have different shape, have different aesthetic characteristics. These are what you call the functional aesthetics. Now, but diversification is not only about functional aesthetics, but deeper rooted in the ways of being in the world. Technology is not merely universal rationality, as what we tend to understand, we moderns tend to understand, but rather each technology carries in itself a complex of ontological, epistemological, and cosmological presuppositions. So let me give a very simple example. If we think of social network, Facebook, and so on, we discussed about this morning. First of all, you have to define what is a user. You have to define what is a group. You have to define what is a society. And these definitions are already, or this definition already presuppose certain epistemology, certain ontology, even certain cosmology, when we think of larger scale machines used in exploitation of nature. With Henri Bergson, we may discover a history of techno-diversity in different cultures, in China, in Japan, in South America, but also in Poland, for example. But we have to move beyond historical studies and ask what the implication of the heterogeneity of these technical facts might be, and what kind of technological future could we imagine from the perspective of diversity. Now, I tend to think that the free software movements and open source movement in the past decades moved in certain sense in this direction, moving towards alternatives and so on. However, the lack of a systematic research on the question of techno-diversity and its implication, namely its past and its future, didn't bring forward a concrete methodology and pedagogy concerning the study of technology. So open source kind of ended by being absorbed into these big companies and so on. These three, I formulate this diversity in terms of biodiversity, new diversity, and techno-diversity. And this we already discussed about today. These three diversities are closely related. The reduction of techno-diversity will lead directly to the decrease of biodiversity. So, for example, if we use pesticides, for example, which is universal, which kill all the insects everywhere in the world, but the effect of using it varies from one place to another. But the reduction of techno-diversity leads directly to the decrease of biodiversity and the homogenization of new diversity, because technology is the support of thinking. And if we all use the same support, of course, you cannot expect that there is going to be diversification. However, the weakness of our civilization today is that we tend to accept a technology or not according to its economic and productive value. We have failed to take technology as a form of thinking and to reorganize the dynamic in the constellation of thinking through technology. If today, I want to conclude, we have to read Bergson's analysis of war seriously, it is because we are confronting a greater danger, which unfortunately has been often analyzed from the perspective of real politics, or merely ideological antagonism between authoritarianism and liberalism. And I think this is really a pity today, that we haven't thought enough about technology. That is to say, analysis beyond economic and military costs are considered ineffective and unrealistic. Today, maybe we can say that war is the triumph of homogeneity and unfortunately, consumerism is falsely presented as a heterogeneous alternative. And so you can have wars, but then you can produce more diversity or heterogeneity in consumerism. If there is a value in Bergson's analysis, it is no longer his vitalist critique, which I believe is already surpassed, but rather his organological critique of the source of war and the necessity to diversify through and with technology. I therefore suggest the agenda of techno-diversity as a possible response to this impulse and as a rereading of Bergson's work. So I will end here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Yuk, for this wonderful lecture. Before we take questions from you, let us discuss a little bit about the book in a direct relation to the lecture. And I'm going to ask you about techno-diversity, but first, let me ask about cybernetics, right? Because your book is a treatise on cybernetics. So you decide to speak of cybernetics when cybernetics, seems to be a distant technological epoch, right? This is not our epoch today. Moreover, your approach to cybernetics is quite surprising because your reading of cybernetics ground cybernetics thinking in German idealism, in the philosophy of nature. So my question is, how this reading of cybernetics allows us to better understand the technological moment in which we have ended up?
Right. Well, this is a very good question, but you will need quite some time to elaborate. So first of all, why cybernetics? In the 1960s, 1964, in an essay titled "The End of Philosophy and the Task of Thinking," Martin Heidegger says, cybernetics marked the end of Western philosophy and metaphysics. Cybernetics marked the end of cybernetics and metaphysics. But very interestingly, today we don't really hear so often the word cybernetics. But the Department of Philosophy still exists everywhere, in all the universities. No? Because the term cybernetics has been absorbed in all other disciplines such as information science, computer science, library science. Library science is also fading away. But in all these engineering disciplines, the word cybernetic, it was already absorbed. So it become invisible. So this is why you ask, did Heidegger make a mistake by saying that, making such a bold claim about cybernetics as the end of philosophy? On the other hand, we also see, for example, today, whenever this term cybernetics is invoked, it's immediately accused as about control, about surveillance. And therefore, we have to destroy machines, we have to destroy the servers in order to save us. For example, there was a book by the French collective Tikkun called Cybernetic Hypothesis, where they basically they describe cybernetics as the rise of a system of control and surveillance of the modern individuals. Now, I wanted to provide a different understanding of cybernetics because I think that we are more than ever in the epoch of cybernetics. Because cybernetics for me is not about developing a machine, it's not a concrete machine. Cybernetics is an epistemology. Cybernetics is an epistemology, and this is very important because in my talk at some point I try to show that if we read the history of modern European philosophy, from the 17th century was dominated by mechanism, mechanist thinking. In the 18th century, there was emergence of the concept of organism, and the concept of organism has influenced many philosophers. Of course, Leibniz was already influenced, but before Leibniz, there's also the Platonic school in Cambridge, for example. But in the 18th century, the person who was influenced so much by organism and see the potential of mobilizing the developing philosophical thinking around organism was Immanuel Kant, especially his 1790 critique of judgment. Simondon, I think you also talked about today, Simondon, in one of the small texts in 1961 called Cybernetics and Epistemology, he has a really funny remark. He said, only in the critique of judgment, in the third critique, was Kant able to deal with cybernetics. And my whole book is basically explain why Simondon says this, and why Heidegger says this between Simondon and Heidegger. So for me, cybernetics is basically epistemology, and epistemology that claims to, which we can call organismic. And because Kant was trying to create a new condition for philosophy by saying that, when I say a condition of philosophizing, it means that for philosophy to be, it has to become organic. It has to create a rupture between mechanism and organism, because we cannot, reduce a human being to a machine. We cannot even reduce a caterpillar to a machine. So the very young Kant, before he wrote Critique of Pure Reason, he already, said in an exclamation, how can an animal body be possible? So in Kant, he creates a new condition of philosophizing. That means for philosophy to be, it has to be organic. And you find this in Fichte, in Schelling, in Hegel. That's why I start this lecture with the Hegel aspiration to the states, to the modern political states as an organic totality. This opposition between mechanism and organism was for me the foundation of a reading of the history of modern European philosophy. However, I claim that this condition was already rendered obsolete by cybernetics. When cybernetics claimed, and if you remember my quote, where Norbert Wiener claims that the cybernetic machine is able to, assimilate or living the time of living being. So basically, cybernetics put an end to this opposition. And this also opened for me a new condition of philosophizing. So what is to come after cybernetics? For philosophy. So that's why I wanted to write a treatise on cybernetics grounded in history of philosophy. And also trying to show that we must understand machines and technology in a very different way. Because today, philosophers, sociologists, and many people working in the humanities, when they talk about machine, they still have the machine of Descartes, of the time of Descartes in their mind. A mechanical duck, a mechanical machine that is linear and repetitive. But this is no longer the case. And so, therefore, we have to develop a new philosophy. Developing a new philosophy is not a good term. We need to identify the new condition of philosophizing, of doing philosophy. So that is the primary purpose of this book.
Yeah. Okay, and in order to reinterpret this epistemology of cybernetics beyond the initial idea of control, which was that of Wiener in a way, right? But it's more complicated. You developed the idea of organology, right? In a dialogue with thinkers such as Bergson, Simondon, Canguilhem, and last but not least Bernard Stiegler, right? And you argued that in order to understand, in order to reinvent technology beyond the false opposition human-machine, right, or organism-mechanism, we have to become, in a way, organologists rather than technologists, right? And in your lecture, you mentioned that the origins of organological thinking is to be found in Bergson's philosophy, namely that of mysticism. So how do you subscribe to this tradition, and what is the link between organology and the central concept of this book, which is that of recursivity?
Right. So thank you very much for this question, because I should explain what is the essential difference between mechanism and organism or cybernetic machine that I want to, or this organic condition of philosophizing that I'm identifying. So a mechanism, it's not simply about machine. A mechanism means a linear causality. So one cause leads to an effect is the cause of the second effect, and so on and so forth. So in a mechanical machine, when one part is broken, the whole thing is broken.
So if you have a mechanical watch, one part is broken, then it's gone. But what is so different between organism is that, first of all, organism consists of a reciprocity between the whole and different parts. So there is always a reciprocity. There are two key concepts that Immanuel Kant used to describe. One is reciprocity, the other is community. So an organism is a community. I'm a community of my different parts of different parts of my body, and this body basically reciprocally connect with each other, but also connect with the whole to constitute a human being, for example. So the difference is that the mechanism in organism is no longer a linear causality, but rather a circular, which I call recursivity. In the past, for a mechanism, whenever a contingent event happens, for example, one part is broken, then the whole machine is broken. For an organism, a contingent event is actually something that could provoke the machine, provoke the organism even to become stronger. The organism actually needs contingency in order to produce, to evolve. So contingency, which was something that has to be, or error, which are something has to be rejected by mechanical thinking, becomes something extremely productive in the recursive thinking. Today, if you look at machine learning algorithm, it's all based on error. You have to train the machine learning algorithm by first of all throwing some noise. You have to throw some noise so the machine can learn by itself. So these are the fundamental difference between two epistemologies here, mechanism and organism. So this is, I think, that is a really great contribution of Immanuel Kant in Critique of Judgment, even though it's a very strange book because it's divided into aesthetic judgments and teleological judgments. But they are all based on the same epistemology. Now, I try to show that how this organic thinking developed in the 20th century into different thought. One is organicism in biology. That is a further development from embryology. And one of the wonderful historians who documented this is Donna Haraway. So Donna Haraway, for me, is a thinker of organicism. The second is what I call mechano-organicism, that is cybernetics. That means machine is capable of profiting from this recursive causality and the necessity of contingency. The third branch is here what we call organology, to think about the relation between machines and organism. So these three thoughts, organicism, mechano-organicism, which is cybernetics, and organology, for me, are the three major legacies of this condition of philosophizing that Immanuel Kant developed towards the end of the 18th century.
And here we come with negative organology. Yeah. The strong point of your lecture was that what we are witnessing today is negative organology. And with a nod to Bergson again, you argue that negative organology produces war or reactionary movements if we fail to put the artificial organs in the right place, right, in order to open a new technological epoch. And your suggestion in many works you wrote is that we have to fragment the technosphere and open new era, that of technodiversity, right? I think that this is the crux of this concept is the crux of your political theory, along that of cosmotechnics. So how do you, what do you want to say through these two concepts, technodiversity and cosmotechnics, and how can they produce a change in order to get out of this uniformity of things you were talking about in your lecture?
Right. So, well, let me explain first of all what I call by cosmotechnics, because this is a kind of neologism that I developed to claim that there have been actually different concepts of techniques or technologies. Because first of all, I study computer science, and for me, when I was a student of computer science, computer engineering, for me, technology is universal. It's logical, rational, universal. There's no negotiation. It's like 1 + 1 = 2. You don't argue with me. So that was what I learned when I was a computer engineer. And then later on, at the time I was very much interested in artificial intelligence. So I wanted to work further on artificial intelligence, and one thing I want to deal with was phenomenology, and that took me to Heidegger and a phenomenological critique of AI, and that kind of took me to become a student of philosophy, and no longer practice so much on technical stuff. And during my formation in philosophy, especially we focus on technology, then what I found is that all the literatures that I have studied are mostly European literatures on technology, on the concept of technology. Sometimes American, but mostly European, from Plato to Heidegger, for example. And so I asked myself, when I was rather young, I said, so what really does it mean by technology, for example, in China, where, which I know a bit, and what does it really mean by technology in China? Does it have the same connotation as techne in Greeks, which, according to Heidegger, has to do with the unconsumment of being. Unconsumment of being. There is a whole metaphysical connotation of the question of technology. So I asked myself, what does it really mean by technology in China? And I have no answer. I had no answer because no one has written about this. So that's why it took me 10 years to think about this question, because as a scientist, I believe in the rational structure of logic, so I don't want to hurt myself. But at the same time, I also feel that the understanding of technology seems to be quite universal and sometimes homogeneous, because it's mostly in the literature of European philosophy and literature. So I try to, my book, The Question Concerning Technology and Essay on Cosmotechnics, is basically a book I try to understand what does it really mean by technology in China. China also has a different language to understand technology. So I give up the question technology. I try to find in classical philosophy those terms, categories that they use to describe technology, and to think how could I reconstruct a technological thinking. And there I developed this term cosmotechnics, because for me it's also a debate with Norbert Wiener, because I think, and I developed what I call an antinomy of the universality of technology. Because, for example, with Le Wiener, we can say that, and also with Bernard Stiegler, we can say technology is the externalization of memory and the liberation of bodily organs. So, of course, it is universal. Every culture, you find, for example, if it is not exactly writing, there's always drawing, at least, externalization. So, this is the thesis of the antinomy. I bring forward the antithesis of the antinomy, that technology is not anthropological universal, but rather it also has to be understood cosmologically. It has different significance in different cosmological systems. Yeah. So let me give you an example how this could be conceived. Is to think about medicine. So if we look at Chinese medicine, and that is practiced also in Japan, in Korea today, all those terms to describe the body, yin and yang and qi and so on, that is categories to describe the body and techniques how to deal with, are the same vocabularies and categories that used, for example, in cosmology. So technology, of course, it has a universal dimension, but actually it has to be thought also cosmologically in different cosmological contexts. So they have different meanings, different epistemologies, different ontological assumptions, and we must not, kind of mix them together as if there's only one. So that's how I developed the concept of cosmotechnics in my 2016 books. But for me, I'm not a nationalist, and I don't give this is. What interests me is not to develop, a particular Chinese thought or technology. I want to show with China as an example that it is possible to develop different technological thought and different understanding of technologies in different cultures, be that in India, be that in Latin America, so on. So in the past years, I have started many conversations with thinkers and philosophers and practitioners in Japan, in Korea, in Latin America. We are producing a publication on Latin America on the question of Latin American cosmotechnics. And all this bring towards to what I call techno-diversity that I presented at the end of this book as a possibility to really rethink about, because if in this image that I showed earlier, if this technological development is bringing us towards apocalypse, my question is that with the techno-diversity in mind, are we able to reopen the question of time, that we can think about different futures? I will not give you a guarantee, but I think that seeing the impulse that we have and this lack of understanding of the question of technology, we are really far away from understanding technology. We must experiment, we must try to really construct a systematic discourse on what I call the techno-diversity in this book.
Okay, thank you. Can you take some questions for public?
Yeah.
Nope.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, I have questions. I would like to ask about definitions and relations to other fields of science. And the first question is, can we somehow relate seeing the limit, capacity to see the limit and technological tendencies, somehow link this to the theory of affordances of Gibson? Can we see is seeing the limit, can it be connected to affordances like this perceived knowing of possibilities?
Well, I must say that my understanding of J.J. Gibson is quite limited, so I don't know if I can give you a very satisfactory response. But if I understand correctly, what he means by affordance is that, for example, in perception, for example, when we perceive as when we enter into a scenario, let's say someone entered this room, and then this person already perceived that, this is a conference, this is a seminar. because this person was able to, in his perception, to associate the relevance of different objects or in this existing in this environment. Therefore, it can produce a kind of a complex of relevance. Then he can determine that this is a seminar. This is a very, because this is also a very important theory in the development of artificial intelligence. When I was studying artificial intelligence, we all have to study this. But so in this sense, it is very different from what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is that today we are in a rather complex situation that even though we are witnessing the rapid technological acceleration, but at the same time we also feel kind of helplessness and even certain kind of misery. In the past 5 years, I was teaching in Germany and in Hong Kong and some other places. I always try to ask my students in every semester the same question. What do you think about your future? Do you have a future? And I must say that 90% of my students, I often have classes of 100 people, for example, 90% respond that they feel miserable. They feel that there is no possibility to change. They feel miserable. But at the same time, we see technology it accelerates more than ever. So, in this sense, I want to talk about the limit of seeing the future, the limit of feel helplessness. And I think this is our responsibility for the younger generation who don't see any future, even though the transhumanists, claim that our future will be brighter than ever. Ray Kurzweil says by 2025 we are going to become immortal. Now it's 22. I still only have 3 years' time. And then you can improve your eyes, you can improve your heart, you can improve your intelligence, you can improve your emotions. But why are we witnessing something opposite seeing the opposite among the younger generations?
Yeah, thank you for your talk. You located mysticism both in some of your comments, both in relation to the sources of the mechanical as well as the limits of the mechanical. And I thought that was pretty interesting. You also sort of framed technodiversity as a way to counter and engage with universalist conceptions of technology. And I was really glad to hear your response to the last question you asked, which was very helpful because it felt a little bit to me that we were stuck in the Western conundrum of the failures of reason, the failures of rationality, and the point that, when we start to move out of rationality and its own entropic kind of formations, especially in relation to power and rationality, we limit our understandings and discussions of what technology is in and of itself. And I guess I want to ask you, because you were alluding to the question concerning technology by Heidegger. Heidegger is one of the few Western philosophers in my mind who actually kind of tries to engage in a more open, though kind of tacit allusion to irrationality, or perhaps we might call consciousness. Those are different things, of course. So I wonder if one way out of this sort of mess and this apocalypse is to shift out of linearity and try to look at other ways of knowing and being that have actually always been part of our world, continue to be part of our world, and therefore we can really rethink what technology is. For example, permaculture, right? And an environmental technology that kind of emerged out of Aboriginal communities that dates back 1,000+ years. Now it's become like a hip thing for hippies and environmentalists, but it's permaculture is the idea of a technology as an interface between environmental systems and human systems. So I just wonder how much you feel like this discursive kind of exercise is stuck in the circularity of Western rationality and how it traps us. So, thank you.
Well, I mean, this is a big question, and because to be trapped in Western rationality, I think this is probably, you know, it's very irresponsible for me to say this as a scholar, you know, because I think it's more complex than that. And you mentioned this article by Heidegger. It's a 1949 lecture published in 1953 as the question concerning technology, where Heidegger wanted to trace the question of, he made a distinction between the Greek techne and modern technology. The Greek techne has its essence in poiesis, in bringing forth, in the unconcealment of being. But modern technology has its essence in Gestell and framing, means everything is considered or treated as resource. Two different attitudes towards technology. And for Heidegger, is to go back to the Greek meaning of techne. And here lies the very obscure question, which means, what does it really mean by the unconcealment of being? The question of Sein for Heidegger. I try to provide a provocative response to that in my latest book called Art and Cosmotechnics. That I try to show that the question of being for Heidegger, because being is not about this object, that object, but rather, I would say, in what Heidegger might call the incalculable, the unknown. The question of the being is the unknown. There is the relation between technology to the unknown, that which I will not call it rational. I also will not call it irrational. I call it non-rational. So it's not irrational, it's not rational, it's non-rational. That's for me the question of being in Heidegger. So how are we going to to understand the question of the non-rational and relate the non-rational back to the question of technology? That's what I try to do in my latest book, Art and Cosmotechnics. So I think that Heidegger does want to think beyond, think kind of way out within the Western tradition by going back to the question of being. Because he refused that Europe should go to Buddhism. He said Buddhism doesn't belong to the Wurzeln, to the root of Europe. Europe should find its solution, its root, but not elsewhere. I mean, of course, we can discuss all about this and his relation to National Socialism, but probably not a subject we want to enter right now. But there are efforts to think, beyond the limit of technology today within the Western, the history of the West itself. But at the same time, I feel that we are in a situation that we cannot really isolate one each other. We cannot say that, well, let's go back to the origin of Chinese thought and let's find a solution there. And then someone will say, well, let's find the Polish origin of technology, and then there is a solution. I don't think that this is a solution in our time, but rather, but at least there is a basic task we should do is to understand, to rediscover these different meanings of technology, different epistemologies, different ontologies. And because this for me is only the first step, And then we have to go further to produce, and I cannot explain here, which I call the individuation of thinking. How different thinking individuates and creates its own singularity. So that would be my response to that, because I think we have to be very careful with this statement.
Thank you, Yuk, for your talk. I wanted to hear a little bit more about war, because I detected some tones also perhaps of Walter Benjamin, and how he argued that mechanical reproduction technology, as it undermines ritual, which we can connect to mysticism, then a certain kind of war, fascistic war, emerges as the ideal vessel for the masses' aesthetic urges. So can you say a little bit more about war and as the antithesis to this techno-diversity? Thank you.
Right. So thank you very much for this question, because I think that brings us to this Biennale, because I'm speaking in the Biennale, which is a Biennale of art. It's not a philosophy seminar, so thank you for the question. That we come back to the question of art and the question of Walter Benjamin. So for those who are not aware of this text, or for those who have forgotten what this text is about, there's basically about the laws of aura, but let me simplify this, that Benjamin distinguishes two kinds of attitudes towards aesthetics. One is what he called aestheticization of politics. That means, for example, fascism. So fascism is, we were trying to, fascists always go back to tradition, rituals, and so on, and used to aestheticize politics, wars. So because war for the, for example, war for the great, Russian, for example, or back to the Slav culture, and where you really find the possibility for yourself. This is something very kind of very dominant in the time of Benjamin. When he wrote about this, you find in Italy, you find in Germany, you find everywhere in Europe. You also find it in Japan and some other places before the Second World War. So there is aesthetization of politics. Benjamin proposed what he called a politicization of aesthetics as a response of communists. He said, at the end, he said, we communists respond with politicization of aesthetics. And this, for me, is extremely important for us today to interpret the relation between aesthetics and technology, and in the context of politics. Benjamin's, what he means by politicization of aesthetics is, maybe I can, please allow me to interpret this in this way, is that given the technological condition that we have, that's to say the mechanical reproduction of work of art, instead of asking if this is art, instead of asking if photography and cinema is art, let's think how cinema, photography changed the concept of art. That is what Benjamin said. So how could we mobilize technologies today in order to politicize aesthetics and to even to bring forward a new political imagination? That's the key question I think for Benjamin. I agree completely with what he said, but today I suggest an opposed direction. What do I mean by that? What do I mean by that is that that is precisely the subject of my latest book, Art and Cosmotechnics. One part is on Benjamin's text, 1936 text, work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction. I think today we also, especially in the kind of production of art, and especially among artists who came to me, and many artists who practice painting, who practice many kind of handcraft, craft work. They came to me because they feel that they are obliged to use technology. If they want to participate in a biennale, for example, where they have to use technology. So for those who didn't, have no idea about technology before, they were all forced to integrate technology into their element, as elements of their work. For example, for painters, they will have to, to introduce some, emoticon in the painting, so make the painting relevant to technology. And this urgency, or this kind of anxiety to engage with technology in the art, seems to me, for me, it's a very interesting phenomenon, but also very problematic. So that's why I tried to show that, well, maybe instead of asking, how artists could use technology, let's turn it around and ask how art could change technology. And that's to say how different artistic imaginations and artistic practice could actually transform these technologies. This is very significant. There is a long history of art. There's a lot of people working on art. There are a lot of people thinking on art. So maybe it allow us to open a different path to regarding the imagination of technologies. So in my book, I try to, but of course, if we want to do this, we must go back to the concept of art. What is art? And so in my book, Art and Cosmotechnics, I go back to ask what is art what does it mean by art in Europe, in the West? What does it mean by art in China, for example? Details, I'm not going into it, but trying to show the difference of the understanding of art, and try to then I ask how this different understanding of art and this imagination allow us actually to transform technology, to renew our relation to technologies. So that's why I said, of course, I agree with what Benjamin said, but today maybe as a strategy, we're turning around and to ask what could be the contribution of art to technological imagination, development, and implementation.
Okay, Gabi, this is going to be last question because we have to.
Yeah, thank you. It links to the first question actually, because I also wanted to bring the discussion back to the title and also to the realities of the war in Ukraine and also wars in other parts of the world, because you're really thinking about war and machine and the machinic and the mystic. I don't know how to formulate this, but there were many things you talked about that resonated much with me, so thank you for that. And what I would like to address actually is the question of trauma and how we memorize and learn things. Because when you said that the man and machine operate at different time scales, so the learning, or the cybernetic machine learns in itself, but how would you relate to, I guess, the current condition where people preempt wars? So we have a negative projection of the future based on past trauma, assumptions of the past, I guess, and how to dissolve that, and where maybe is there the question of not to stage art now as a solution to trauma, but how to think maybe therapeutically how we unlearn some of the negative toxic mechanism that might always pop up in times of stress, like an economic crisis, that lead to certain mechanized stress responses that might reinforce certain mechanic exosomatizations. As we also saw with Bergson, there was a creative process before, and then there was the war, and we could always, maybe it's also a certain pattern of creative activity, and then a certain intensification of how these technologies are used. I don't know if you can follow me, but maybe some reflections on the current time axis that we are in terms of linear time, and how to eventually dissolve trauma that has been passed on over generations onto organisms, and how that relates to the technologies that we have available to maybe slow down this intensification or this tendency towards preemption of wars or not being able to imagine a future. Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure if I understand correctly the question. So if I understand, I try to, understand in my own way of thinking. So you are talking about two questions. One is the question of trauma. So the historical trauma, and how are we going to deal with trauma?
Or maybe how you would locate it in the triangulation of biology, neurodiversity and technodiversity. So where's the role of trauma also as a means of the organism to adapt, and also as a means of learning how to operate in an environment. Right. That way of thinking. Right.
Yeah. No, I thank you very much for this question. How to locate the question of trauma, and well, that's a very good question. And the second part is about preemptive, the time scale and preemptions. Yeah. So I think if you ask me where is the place of trauma, I will rather put the first of all, it depends on which trauma. So, for example, this could be, let's say, let's say if this is the meltdown of the nuclear plant, for example, in Fukushima or so on, then it's also a trauma related to other species and not only to human beings. But it could also be a trauma that is related to a kind of historically, for example, the war of one people against another people, and which leads to genocide and so on. So I think the question of trauma could be understood according to different contexts and different. But I would say that, but in general, I would say that the question of trauma, of course, is always retained in a kind of new diversity in the thinking of the people. Because new diversity, as we all know in today's discussion, new comes from nous, the Greek words for thinking. And there are different ways of, because in different thinking, in different culture, we have different way of being with, for example, the non-human beings. For example, in Latin America, you find different ways of being with animals. For example, in the work of many great ethnographers, like ethnologists, like Eduardo Viveros de Castro, who try to document, but also make sense the perspectivism you find in Latin America. So perspectivism means, like, for example, the animal, the human and the non-human could exchange perspective. So, for example, if I'm a hunter chasing a boar, for example, and when the boar looks back, the boar may become a hunter and I become the prey. In the sense that there is the relation between the human and non-human is not exactly the same we find in the modern Western society. So there is a kind of new diversity that the new diversity is not only about how we think, but also for me is our different way of being in the world with the non-humans and with humans, with the complex of inhumans, for example, mountains, rivers, and even the cosmos, and so on. So if in different cultures, you always find a singularity of the nous, and this singularity is also the consequence of the traumas that stay with these people, stay in this culture, and then maybe carry on, and maybe mobilize as a nationalist movement, can be also mobilized as for good use and bad use, of course. So now the other part is about preemption, preemptive, and this for me, I think this is a really critical question, because preemption is basically the basic mode of operation of digital technology today. Be that used in consumerism, for example, Amazon, everyone experienced this, or on the level of the nation state, of the sovereign state. In terms of identify who is terrorist, identify who has the potential of starting the war, and this preemptive thinking is the dominant mode of thinking about technologies, big data. For example, let me give you an example. In the past, during the outbreak of the coronavirus, if the most well-developed discipline is data science. Not other disciplines. Other disciplines all suffers, but data science, they grow up really quickly, and more students, more money, because we are in a society of prediction, and these predictions sometimes are really ridiculous. Really, really ridiculous. And I think that we need to really very careful with this, the society of preemption. And that can also come to the question that we have been discussing throughout the whole day, is that given this is the only vision of technological development today, what could be the other vision that we can have regarding technologies, and how could we build them together, for example, with thinkers, with artists, with engineers. And I think we are really in the lack of this kind of initiatives, and more significantly for me, a systematic approach or systematic understanding of the methodology and pedagogy to think about the question of technology, of technodiversity, and how they relate to our future.
Thank you, Yuk, for sharing your thoughts with us. Thank you for your lecture, this discussion. Thank you for your questions.
Thank you.